I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico, your co-host, and I'm really into pirates now. That's a weird thing to say at the top of a podcast, but it's true. In these terrible pandemic times, Dean got me to read a book about pirates, and I love pirates now.
The thing about pirates is that it's not all Disney movies and Jack Sparrow, although, as people who follow me on Twitter know, that's a very important part of it. The thing about pirates is it's also a workers' movement of the sea. And holy cow, I can't stop getting enough of it in this pandemic times. As soon as I can get out of this apartment, I'm going to find myself the nearest big schooner and make my way out into Lake Ontario.
That's right. I'm going to get a barrel of limes and I'm going to join the crew and get all the way down to Davy Jones' locker.
Yep. Take back what's ours from the old naval fleet.
Oh, man. Dean and I have been really getting into Marcus Rediker, who is a historian, a Marxist historian who writes about pirates, who wrote a book called The Villains of All Nations, and it is rad as hell. Unfortunately, we are not going to talk about pirates in this episode. We're going to talk about something worse, bad. The pirates of Twitter. No, they're not even that cool.
No, they're the Royal Navy of Twitter.
That's right, the Royal Navy of Twitter. We're going to talk about the dumb, stupid, and awful religious left discourse that's been going on this past week because of a dumb, stupid, and awful New York Times article that came out called Christianity Gets Weird by Tara Isabella Burton. The article itself, man, it is severely confused and has a lot of considerable errors in it that we'll talk about in just a minute, maybe. But its worst offense is that it made everyone talk about the religious left again. And it shouldn't have. We're going to talk about some of the responses that all of the journalist types have been having to the overarching religious left conversation, why they're bad, and we're going to be revisiting some older content of ours to talk about the religious left in the only right, true, and good way. So before we do that, though, let's just talk about this dumb New York Times article. Okay, Dean, talk about it. Quick, please.
Yeah, we cannot stay on it because I will surely die. But it is an article, as you said, called Christianity Gets Weird. The framing of the article is hard to talk about exactly because it's all very confusing. It's hard to know where to dive in. Here's the most neutral way I can put it.
Oh.
Yeah. Fair and balanced. It's an article that tries to present Christians who are interested in Christianity, that good old time religion, but even older than that, tries to present those Christians who are interested in that sort of thing as kind of bucking the trend of modernity, as preparing an interesting counterculture of resistance to all the strange trends of social distancing, of social media, of technology, of capitalism, etc. That's the neutral way of putting it. In reality, what it does is it throws a whole bunch of people who are on Twitter, basically, into a mess, and says they're all doing the same thing, including people like, maybe people know of Benjamin Crosby, is like an Anglican Episcopal socialist kind of type, conservative socialist guy. Throws that guy into the same pot as like Rod Dreher, a Francoist, Spanish Catholic loving reactionary who has a popular blog that we've talked about too much on this website. The article tries to sort of throw all these people in a big pot and say, this is weird Christian sort of trend in the world and how fascinating that must be. And it has made Christianity punk again.
It's a problem.
I feel confused just talking about it, just trying to explain it. I can't even do it. But hopefully I hit the high points.
Right. I mean, it is trying to make Christianity seem punk, which is a problem for so many reasons. It's trying to paint Christianity as this thing that is surprisingly progressive sometimes and also transgressive against social values like capitalism. But really, it does just a very confusing job of that. The way that you kept describing it, Dean, as putting people into a pot is a very good, very good analogy.
I don't know why it kept coming up.
You know, in the town that I grew up in, there is a festival called the Burgoo Festival. And I don't know what that word even really means, but it was a festival where everyone brings one thing and you throw it into the pot and you just have a big, gross, yucky stew.
Love it.
And that's what that article is kind of like. And to make matters worse, if one bad article wasn't enough, all of your fave religious left journalists decided that they too were going to throw something in that big yucky pot on Twitter. And all of Saturday, all of Sunday, our entire weekend was ruined because people were disagreeing loudly on Twitter about the religious left. And there's some hot takes about it. Okay. Wait. Hang on. Pause. Back up. Reverse. I just need to quickly say this. Christianity is not punk. I don't ever want anyone to say that ever again. Stop.
Especially extremely conservative high church Christianity is especially not punk. Doubly not punk.
It's not. No, it's not. I hate that. I hate that whole trope. No one should say anything is punk but punk, and that's it. Let's let words mean something in this one occasion. Okay. Play. We can go back to what we were doing.
Right.
Okay. So there's a whole lot of different takes. A whole lot of people chimed in on this. I mean, if you exist on Twitter, you know about it and you hate it, I'm sure, as much as I do. But I think that we are going to parse out this episode along the two different axes of two different religious left types of journalists. We're gonna talk about we'll start the conversation off with this. Liz Brunig, she is a person. She writes articles. She covers religion. She covers politics. Everyone knows her on Twitter. She's fine. So Liz Brunig, she says this on Twitter. It is a problem for us, and the way that we're going to organize this conversation is around this question. So she says, the problem is there's no meaningful religious left, as I've written, and there's never going to be one. Not in the USA anyways. It's just people on the internet, and even then, I guarantee you, there are more bronies than Catholic socialists. It's quite the statement. It's bombastic. It's untrue and problematic in a whole lot of ways. There is kind of like a kernel of something in there that she's talking about that like you kind of get. Like, there's not a well-funded and powerful network of leftist Christians in the United States who are guiding the president.
There's no Sandinistas in the U.S.
That's right. There are no Sandinistas in the U.S. And there's not ever going to be. That's just unimaginative thinking, but maybe she's right. Okay. So Liz Brunig, to the question, does the religious left exist? She thinks no. Okay. So there's that. Dean, do you want to talk about the other end, the other axes of our conversation here?
Yeah, sure. Okay, the other axis is Jack Jenkins. He's a journalist who has made it like his personal brand to cover the religious left. He, among others, have kind of made the religious left a journalism meme or trope. And whatever, more power to you. Everybody's got to find their niche. The way that Jack Jenkins covers it can be somewhat frustrating, but also he finds, certain things that are worth covering, etc. Anyway, he responded to this assertion by Liz Brunig that the religious left doesn't exist with a pretty, as you might suspect, resounding rebuttal, saying, note, there's nothing on the left that looks or operates like the religious right. The modern left is organized as a coalition of coalitions and often disagrees with itself at all levels, religious or otherwise. There isn't a machine politics apparatus that rivals the religious right. He goes on to say in a Twitter thread descending from that in another tweet that there's a lot of disagreement over what people count as left in the first place. It's not like a term that we all agree on, including scholars don't all agree on it, which is true. But as we'll see in a minute, it doesn't make it meaningless. He does say, though, that the left in general is this kind of amorphous thing that collects lots of elements, and when it can do that, then it's really powerful. And there's a religious element in there too. And the religious left is, just like the regular left, full of all kinds of disparate people and movements and things. And the key is to kind of see where those little things show up, and then where they kind of coalesce into something. So I think that's the Jack Jenkins response, which is to say, well, to say there's no such thing as the religious left is, first of all, to misidentify the religious left, which is, I think, true. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But secondly, it's also to ignore all these kinds of grassroots organizations that do exist on the ground, out in the world.
Yeah, I think that's good. So on the one hand, we got Liz Brunig. Does the religious left exist? No. Then we got Jack Jenkins. Does the religious left exist? Yes. You have heard it said, both of these things, but we say, Jack Jenkins is kind of right. The religious left does exist, but more interestingly than he seems to think, I would say. Mm-hmm. So yes, the religious left does exist, but only if it's bigger than just the electorate, right? It's bigger than electoral politics. It's bigger than the Democratic Party. And, who cares about Nancy Pelosi quoting the Bible? But also, it's more than just that, too, because the left is a lot weirder than Jack Jenkins usually notices, right? Like, sometimes he covers interesting stories, and it's cool, but a lot of times he leaves out really interesting stories, like, never once has a religious left type focused on what was the Friendly Fire Collective or whatever, right? And any of their like actions. So, I mean, Jack Jenkins is right in some of these ways, but also I think what the religious left actually is, from maybe a deeper analysis, exceeds his perspective. Yeah,
that's right. All right, now we've got the two kind of meta positions on the table here that we'll intervene in a minute here. That's kind of just maybe like a cross section that we could use to say a little bit more by way of setup. So obviously there's lots of other people who said lots of other things on Twitter. I don't know, probably none of it's interesting. I said some things I don't even remember. They're probably not interesting either. The huge sticking point really in all these conversations, though, I think, is what counts as the left. Some folks think that the left is just being a Democrat. Other people think that it means something different, that it's a little bit bigger, or it's being a specific kind of Democrat, or whatever. There's a lot of debate around, where to draw the boundaries of that term. So what else can we do as Marxist Christians specifically than try to add a little bit of nuance to this conversation? I mean, obviously we have an ideological perspective, right? We come from a Marxist tradition or whatever, but the thing about Marxism, as the good science that it is, you have to look at the material conditions themselves and articulate them in a way that's honest, right? Not in a way that's just wishful thinking. So one thing that's helpful when we're defining the left is trying to say, well, there are great gradations within the left. The left is a rhetorical term that we use to capture certain things fairly or unfairly. And there are better and worse ways of parsing out what that means. So in this episode, we'll do a little bit of an intervention in this ongoing religious left discourse and try to parse out the difference between being on the left in some ways and being on the left in some other ways. And hopefully that will also allow us to see the religious left a little bit differently. So one more thing by way of intro here. We've talked about the problem of the religious left as a concept in the past on kind of a bunch of episodes now, like 3 or 4. Back then we said that most of the discourse around the religious left basically shows that it's kind of a journalism meme, right? It's a construct that journalists use to sell their stories to editors who will buy them if they can be convinced that this is something worth covering. But it also is true that there are important religious people on the left, and there are leftists interested in religion, right? So if the religious left is trying to identify something in the world, then sure, maybe we could talk more about that. When it actually comes down to the discourse surrounding like this article and kind of the article or the tweets in general, again, that conversation always revolves around defining the left. There's the religious left as people who go to church and also vote for Democrats. There's the religious left as progressive people who find some connection between their politics and faith. And then there's the religious left that's to the left of mainstream progressivism. We're going to work out an even more detailed taxonomy in a minute, but hopefully that just kind of gets us swirling around a little, some different possibilities that term could open up if we tried to complicate it.
Yeah, so let's do it. Let's complicate it by way of making it more clear. So what is the left? We've definitely talked about this before so many times in so many episodes, but I don't care. We're doing it again because the material conditions demand it.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of different ways we could probably answer this question. What is the left, and like maybe how is it distinct from liberalism? But I think the best place to look is actually revisiting an article from 1984. From the Monthly Review, which is a magazine that still exists that you should subscribe to, by Sister Kathleen Schultz, who used to be the National Secretary for Christians for Socialism in the U.S. It's a helpful article. I mean, it's dated, obviously, because it's from 1984, but it's a helpful article because she breaks down the Christian left into 4 categories. And she's talking about the Christian left, but we should note here that it's not just, I mean, there's not just a Christian left. If there is, it's probably small, but there's a religious left in general that is made up of all kinds of people of different faiths, right? And I think that's an important thing to know in these conversations. Kathleen Schultz is writing specifically about the Christian left, but I think a lot of these same distinctions can be made of a religious left in general. Does that sound fair, Dean?
Yeah, I think so. You'd have to do a little more work maybe we'll make that as a caveat. All right, we're going to follow Kathleen Schultz in restricting our conversation to Christians because that's the only thing we have any business talking about, obviously.
That's fair, yes.
But yes, you could probably do some work to figure out how to adapt this taxonomy that could be broadened out to make sense of other traditions.
Yeah, good. Helpful caveat that lets us off the hook just a little bit. But if you're interested in the larger conversation about the religious left versus the Christian left, there is actually a really good article in Sojourners called "The Media's Religious Left is Erasing Marginalized Communities of Faith" by Harmeet Kamboj, which is it's a good kind of explanation of what is going on here, sort of rhetorically and in the media with regards to the religious left and the Christian left and how these two things kind of get conflated in some problematic ways. So something to go read if you can read. And you should.
Yeah, it's a good addition to the conversation. All right, so why don't we dive into Kathleen's taxonomy, and then once we get through that a little, we can expand it. We can come back to Liz Brunig and Jack Jenkins. Does that sound like a good strategy?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. The first category, there are 4 categories in total. And they move progressively kind of down the spectrum toward the left. The first category is what Kathleen calls center Christians, which she says includes both Protestant and Catholic liberals within the mainstream U.S. denominations. Basically, good institutionalists, right? They believe in the working of the Democratic Party. They believe in their own church institutions. They're pretty run-of-the-mill liberal types. There's nothing too exciting about them. I think if you had to plot like specific people here, maybe you could say like, I don't know, Nancy Pelosi would be the political analog, right? Like she is a Catholic, I guess, and also a Democrat,
Sure.
who's not a radical lady, right? In terms of like churches, I guess you'd have to go find like some kind of basic average Protestant leader who agrees with all this stuff. They're probably not hard to find, but I don't know any of them. But anyway, center Christians, that's the first one. They're right smack dab in the middle. I want to introduce the
terrible,
second category.
awful.
Yes,
I don't like
exactly. Beige, gray, not cool. not punk. Let me talk about the second category, though, and then we'll talk about them both together, because I think they kind of go together. So the second category, moving a little bit further down the left, is center-left Christians. Kathleen says their activity is based in anti-capitalist critique within a social democratic framework, but she means that framework is still within the Democratic Party. And she also says that they're explicitly anti-communist. So when you hear a social democratic framework, don't think like, oh, they're, Bernie Sanderites or something. These are Christians who are like a little more concerned about social justice, but still attached to their institutions in really important ways. The reason I draw these two out together is that I think that a lot of religion left journalism is basically just these two categories, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's Christians who are invested in the Democratic Party, and it's people in the Democratic Party who are invested in making relationships with pastors or speaking at churches, right? This is the religion journalism where it's like Elizabeth Warren spoke in front of a crowd of 80 pastors, or it's the religion journalism that says this pastor is going around trying to, I don't know, drum up support for this or that bill in legislation. That's the bulk, I think. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think that makes sense as a description for sure. Okay, well, after that, we have the third category. Kathleen Schultz writes, a third major sector of the Christian left are the socially committed. They have a more thoroughgoing critique of capitalism and have begun to develop an alternative ecclesial and theological awareness. However, they are unable to project alternatives ideologically, organizationally, or programmatically. Their activity in the main takes the form of prophetic denunciation and symbolic resistance. So, I think that makes sense as a group of people. I mean, I think that this might come off a little bit harsh, but like you might think of something like the Poor People's Campaign or as this kind of category, right? Like, I don't want to say that the Poor People's Campaign only does symbolic resistance, but at the same time, they're not like they're not militantly anti-capitalist in the ways that like some other Christians who are further to the left might be. But I think it's a helpful distinction to make, right? People who are socially committed to lots of all kinds of social ills, they have a critique of capitalism as being sort of a problem. And they have some ideas about it, but unable to think like alternatively along more anti-capitalist lines in terms of socialism, anarchism, communism in that way. So I think that's pretty helpful. And then finally, the furthest down the list, the furthest left of the list, maybe the top of the the leftist pyramid. I don't know exactly which way to do this, but she writes that there's a final category is that of the politically committed Christians characterized primarily by revolutionary left practice and socialist political commitment. This is it. This is as far as left as you can go. But these are Christians who I think, like the last, understand capitalism as a problem and who have sort of like a more thoroughgoing idea of what an alternative might be for them. I mean, Kathleen Schultz is writing this thinking of socialism particularly, but you could be an anarchist and kind of fit into this category too, I think.
The last time we talked about this taxonomy, we made the mistake of putting the Catholic worker in the third category of socially committed Christians.
Wouldn't do that
which
again.
Was I think that was the episode that prompted Joe Cruz and Brenna Cusson to come on our show and talk to us and set us straight. So now the Catholic worker belongs in the fourth category. That's the official Magnificast line.
Yeah, I mean, I think an important part of being a Marxist is understanding self-criticism, and I think that's important. We were wrong.
That's right. We were wrong. Mea culpa.
Shane Claiborne, though, he does still deserve to be in the third category. Well, maybe in the second too. He's on the cusp.
I think he's outside the Democratic Party, but critical of capitalism, but prophetic denunciation and symbolic resistance. That seems very on brand.
Yeah, exactly. That's good.
What I like about these categories is it's really easy to talk about the left as like one big monolith, right? And that's what a lot of these conversations are doing. It's almost like people are kind of like intentionally misunderstanding one another because they put the left into one big gumbo pot, like we talked about earlier. But in fact, the left is full of all these strange political gradations. And when it comes to the Christian left, it gets even stranger, right? Like this taxonomy doesn't map directly onto the left as such.
Right.
You
like
would
there's no
have
mention of race, right? There's no mention of like the
Exactly.
organization of, anti-racist action. And I think that's a huge blind spot of it. But, it's 1984.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, there's all kinds of quibbles that you can make with it, right?
Yeah.
There's no distinction between, like you said earlier, even people like anarchists and Marxists, right? There's all kinds of strategic differences you might want to like push a little further. But by and large, I think what's useful about this is it gets us into this conversation about how Christians relate to the conditions in the United States that are largely set. The terms are largely set by the Democratic Party for the worse, right? Not for better and for worse, for the worse, for sure. And so when you see center Christians and center left Christians kind of operating within that party directly, it's helpful to kind of say, all right, there are divisions even within the Democrats. But then there's a category that's kind of just outside, or maybe it's 1 foot in, 1 foot out, these kind of socially committed Christians. And then there's the final category, which I think is so much more difficult to find, but also to identify and parse out. That's politically committed Christians. That, I think, is one that we'll have to talk a lot more about. But I think it's just useful to kind of see all these categories as ways of creating more nuance and introducing distinctions that allow us to actually talk about what we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I think these types of distinctions are really helpful too, because in the thread of tweets that you read from Jack Jenkins, he says something that's true, but also is a problem as well. So he says that people disagree about what counts as the left, a debate which no one settled on, and that's true. People do debate about what the left counts as, but just because people debate what the left means doesn't mean it doesn't mean anything, right? It means that it's contentious, but like there are things that are surely more left than other things, and at least this kind of gradation helps us see the texture of the left and not just let us abandon the term altogether. And I think that's important.
Yeah. So maybe one way of starting to apply this taxonomy a little bit would be to return to these two tweets in particular. Maybe we could start with Liz Brunig. So I think that like what's so fascinating to me about her particular tweet is that it allows the Democratic Party to basically, again, set the terms for debate. And let me explain a little bit what that means. So she says, just to remind you of the tweet, the problem is there's no meaningfully religious left, as I've written, and there's never going to be one. Not in the USA, anyway. It's just people on the internet, and even then, I guarantee you there are more bronies than Catholic socialists. Okay. There's a way in which this tweet can make sense and a way in which it doesn't. I think that, like, if you take the sort of Democratic Party as the standard bearer for what we mean by the left, then in a sense, it's true that there's not really a meaningful religious left insofar as there's not a coalition of specifically religious interested constituencies that are just waiting to kind of hear how they can get on board in the Democratic Party, right? Like, and vice versa too. There's not a coalition of religious people within the Democratic Party who are enthused about being Democrats in a way that matters. There's all kinds of religious people that are Democrats, all kinds of religious people even who probably are enthusiastically Christian and Democrat, let's say. But it doesn't really make a difference that they're a Christian. That's not the deciding factor of how to build a coalition for a Democratic electorate. So in that sense, there's no meaningfully religious left. But it seems strange to basically decide the term religious left lives or dies based on whether or not you can locate it within the Democratic constituency. And that's something that I think Kathleen Schultz helps us to sort of enter into in a more nuanced sort of way.
Yeah, exactly. Because we can see up and down this gradation of center left, social committed, and like the more like revolutionary practice Christians. Like all of these groups do exist in these different types of interesting ways. Center not so much. That's uninteresting. That's boring. I'll stick with that one. But the rest of it is definitely, they do exist in all kinds of ways. You just have to kind of look, and they're there.
Right. All right, Matt, I'm going to turn it to you. How can you've said a little bit about it already, so I'll just ask you to expand. How do you think these categories maybe open up a little bit more of Jack's rejoinder to Liz Bernig?
Right. Definitely the thing about like what counts as the left. This is a helpful correction, I suppose. I also, Jack says there's nothing on the left that operates and looks like the religious right. And I don't know if that's necessarily true either. I think we can see all kinds of center Christians and center left Christians even that like work kind of like the religious right. They don't have the same types of funding and maybe efficacy, but they definitely do exist. Like, things like sojourners do exist. Like Jim Walsh will show up for Democratic politicians and Democratic causes all the time. Barack Obama had center and center left Christians surrounding him in office, and like fine. So I don't know. I think that it's untrue to say that there's no such, they don't, and the religious left might not mirror the religious right in any ways. It's true that they're not as efficacious. That's important for sure. Mm-hmm. But there are some Christians who find that model of like chasing electoralism as a means of getting their agenda done as important, and they do that, and it exists. So I think that's a helpful elaboration we can get here. I don't know. What else is there, Dean?
One thing that I think Jack gets right is that the left is a collection of disparate elements. For the record, I think the right is too. I think it's a mistake to say the right is a kind of monolith, whereas the left looks different because it's full of all these different interest groups or organizing capacities. That's just politics. We make the mistake of making the right into this kind of capital R villain that's really easy to look at when in fact
that's true.
A lot more complicated. But all that to say, Jack's right though, to say that the left is full of all these interesting coalitions, and sometimes those coalitions can reach a critical mass and sometimes they don't, but that doesn't mean that they do or don't exist. You gotta kind of parse it out. I think the trouble here, and where Kathleen is really useful, is showing the coalitions that Jack Jenkins is not interested in or aware of, or it's hard to figure out the right kind of word to use, but the coalitions that matter to Jack Jenkins mostly seem to me to be center and center left religious types. Occasionally also the socially committed, right? Like he does a lot of coverage of the Poor People's Campaign specifically, right? You can imagine him doing all kinds of coverage about stuff like Shane Claiborne or whatever. That's the kind of stuff that really is like his journalistic bread and butter. But maybe this is a good time to introduce this fourth category we could talk more about. The thing that never shows up, it seems to me, in Jack Jenkins's work, but not just him. He's not the only offender here. This is a industry-wide problem, is this category of politically committed Christians, which is to say Christians who are part of a revolutionary left tradition, who have a socialist political commitment that doesn't operate within the confines of the Democratic Party. I think this is a really significant omission because it means that we miss out on all kinds of stories that are very interesting. So just in a kind of neutral journalistic sense, it makes a difference that people ignore these stories. But B, it also does shape what we think is possible. It truncates our imagination of what the left is, what it could be, and then, of course, the religious piece that involves in that too. What could religion reasonably be expected to get on board with or not? So in that sense, I think the categories help us to affirm one piece of Jack Jenkins's correct sort of identification, that, the religious left exists. It's out there in movements and all kinds of stuff. But then it also, Kathleen's categories helps us to see where Jack Jenkins has missed some of the most interesting or most radical left coalitions that he could be covering.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's also the case that the politically committed Christians who belong to some kind of revolutionary tradition are, I think, way less populous than the socially committed, the socially committed but not explicitly like revolutionary Communist Party Christians or whatever, right? Like the example, the most contemporary example that we always pull out is usually Friendly Fire or something, right? But there are all kinds of other folks too. Like, I mean, like Catholic workers, the valve turners, they're exactly these types of Christians, but their stories oftentimes get pushed to the side. That being said, though, too, that there's plenty of like good historical types of stories still to tell that would shed light on a lot of the even like the socially committed left Christians. These stories they kind of bleed into one another in a lot of ways, right? Like it's hard to tell stories of labor specifically in Christianity without kind of getting to these more historical left accounts that I think are important. So yeah, I mean they're under realized in sort of the contemporary journalistic scene, I suppose, but also there's like an important historical outlook too that I think is really important for them.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I think this is useful too because so we can make a point about the media narrative that gets created about the religious left, but we can also make a point about where one might go looking for the religious left, and that is like the more interesting question to me, not only because I do some writing as a journalist, but also just as a person in the world trying to think about all this stuff, right? Because okay, you might want to go around and find politically committed Christians. You might want to find people in the Friendly Fire campaign. Maybe you'll find Catholic workers. But also you might go looking for Christians who have given themselves over to political organizations that are to the left of the Democratic Party and also to the left of things like the Poor People's Campaign. I think these are stories that are harder to tell because they take a lot more work. But what I mean is like... when there's a massive strike, let's say, or a movement like Black Lives Matter that is opposed not just to the Republicans, but also to the entire order of white supremacy, it makes a difference if people go down to that kind of movement and ask questions about religion, and then they find the religious left within those kinds of coalitions. That is something that, for whatever reason, religion journalists don't seem to do, which I find so odd because when it comes to electoral politics, they have an obsessive kind of reading with every minute religious reference one could find in a speech by Nancy Pelosi or, you know, when Cory Booker is talking about going to church or something. But when it comes to like other events in the world, no one asks twice about where religion might show up. Just to give maybe one example of this, so I write, for people that don't know, for G's Magazine. I write a section there on civil disobedience. And when there was a Kentucky mining strike last summer, I basically was asking this kind of question of myself, like, where are religious people around this strike? It's an event that gets covered in all kinds of non-religious ways, but surely there are religious people amidst the strikers, right? And as soon as I started looking, there's actually all kinds of local coverage about like people who are getting quoted about, yeah, like my pastor showed up and like prayed for us on the line. And you can find stuff in like the Baptist newspaper about like the Baptist sent some people to go like pray over these folks and bring them supplies and relieve them for a little bit. And it's like that creates an entirely different narrative of what the religious left is or what it could be. It doesn't have to be just like a pastor or a person with a collar deciding to be, I don't know, like on the same stage as a politician and vice versa. It might just be people who happen to be religious who are also involved in left-wing activities or organizations.
Yeah, totally. I think that makes a lot of sense. In January in St. Louis, the janitors went on strike. They're organized with, I guess, SEIU. But anyways, there were like they did like this big action where like a bunch of people sat in the street and got arrested and stopped traffic and stuff. But like of the people who got arrested, like, you know, a lot of them were actually like union janitors, but 3 or 4 of them were just like pastors. But nobody really made us think about that. And I think okay, so first of all, it sucks that story is kind of untold. Like, why are these pastors showing up, right? I think that's a super interesting question, and it'd be cool to hear. But it's also kind of interesting too that in like that sort of community of folks, that it's just kind of expected that they will too. Like, I think that's an interesting avenue too. But all that to say, you're right though that these stories are kind of like left untold because they're not flashy or cool. I mean, I think they're cool, but they're not as flashy as like whatever pastor is going to show up for a politician on stage. It's also hard too because in some ways when we start looking at those types of on the ground examples of religious folks showing up to these types of events or showing up for people in these events or showing solidarity or whatever, you'll find that like these categories probably will break down or people will move up and down the ladder really quickly too, right? Like I can't imagine that like the Baptist pastors that show up for people on the strike line are communists or something. right But they're probably people who are center or center left, and then like all of a sudden though they're like ready to throw in with people who are obviously a lot more left than them, and that's a whole other interesting part of the equation too, that the taxonomy is helpful because it gives like some scaffolding for the tent of this conversation, right? Because if you didn't have the scaffolding, the tent would just fall right in your head and be blind and be terrible. But like at the same time, like sometimes the scaffolding might even kind of get in the way, or we might find ways that it's itself is limited, and we just need to get back and theorize more theory always. But yeah, I mean, it's at least a helpful place to start, and we can even complicate it more.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's also true that, like we said earlier, this is an essay written in the 80s when there were a lot more politically committed Christians that were easier to see. But it is like a striking omission that like the newspaper People's World, which is the Communist Party USA's newspaper, they've been putting out more articles on religion, it seems to me, in the last like couple of years than I've ever seen them put out before. And why no religion journalist is interested in that is a surprise to me. Like, the communists in the United States are invested in the question of religion. That is a great headline. Like, why? Call somebody and ask them, figure that out. I'm sure they would have some really interesting things to say. But the fact that that's not there, I think, speaks to a certain lack of political education among journalists generally that also makes it hard for them to do a more interesting job.
Yeah, I think that you're right. Well, now that we're kind of sort of at the end of the conversation, I guess we're 43 minutes in. Let's turn here and kind of add a good conclusion. Yeah, I mean, so we can. Okay, the Christian left discourse. It's a messy one. People are angry. People are saying things, and they are sometimes problematic. But we can think of it in these more, I think, like. I don't know, materialist terms that Kathleen Schultz gives us, these more like solid categories, at least, that are not perfect but helpful. So we can do all of this, but like, why would we do this? Why is this conversation important? I think is maybe the question to end on. I think there's probably a few reasons to figure this out. I mean, first of all, learning how to tell the story of whatever the religious left is important. I think that's part of it. Just like Dean said a few minutes ago, like if you're a journalist, you're shaping like a lot of people's sort of political worldview and like what they think is possible. So if you tell stories about lots of like really crazy rad Christians who are sabotaging oil pipelines or something, that does something to the political imagination of people who are reading it. So I think that's an important reason why. But I think also for people who are religious and on the left, or people who are just on the left, understanding these dynamics are, I think, a helpful piece of the larger societal analysis, right? Like, it's really important to know the difference between Christians who are center and Christians who are politically committed on the left, right? Like, knowing the difference between those two things is really helpful because, like, then you know who's on your side and who's on whose side, right? Like the values of Christians who are center or even center left are extremely different than the folks who are socially committed or revolutionary or something. In other ways, there's some of these people are not like compatible with one another even, right? There's like there's some severe disagreements amongst all of these groups, and understanding how they break down and how we might add to the complicated nature of these things, I think, is really helpful for political analysis.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it also kind of just brings it back to this question of what does it mean to say there's no meaningfully religious left? Because again, like if you're talking about a Democratic constituency of as yet to be organized voters, then sure, there's no meaningfully religious left. But why would you allow that to set the terms for the conversation?
Right.
It seems to me that, like, even though, let's say, like, members of the Communist Party USA who are interested in religion are extremely small and probably not very efficacious in the grand scheme, that doesn't mean that they're meaningless, right? I mean, maybe this is just the oneism talking, but it's like you have to be on the long road of organizing if you ever want to get anywhere. And oftentimes the most meaningful stuff is actually the stuff that's not all over the headlines. And even more directly than that kind of bizarre example of the CPUSA, like the Catholic worker, like people shutting off oil pipelines, that's pretty meaningful religious left action. People organizing within like unions or people trying to show up for people on the strike line who happen to all be Christians or some other faith. Like that's very, very meaningful religious left presence in the world. And to write that off because some religion journalists like to talk about the Democrats, I think is a severe mistake. Like, not only does it truncate our analysis, it also, like you said earlier, Matt, it becomes an unimaginative problem, and that's the last thing that anybody needs on the left right now, I think.
Unimaginative problem is a good way just to say it's boring. It's boring and it sucks.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Center Christians, it's true. They're meaningless, but also who cares? Not interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So we've done it again. We've revisited this whole topic about the Christian left. And I regret to say that it probably won't be the last time, that this will probably happen again in another few months and we'll have to do it all over again. But listen, here's the good thing. We have this article from 1984 and it's never going to go out of style.
That's right. We should ask Kathleen Schultz to expand it or rewrite it.
Yeah, that would be pretty good. I would really appreciate that if she did it.
Well, I think the one thing that is safe to say by way of conclusion is that whether or not there is no meaningful religious left, there is perhaps no meaningful religious left discourse on Twitter. And that is the big takeaway from this episode. Thanks for listening to The Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/The Magnificast. You can find us on Twitter at The Magnificast. You can send us an email at themagnificast@gmail.com. You can join our Facebook group, The Magnificast Basement. You can buy some merchandise from us at redbubble.com. I was trying to think of what that was. Our music, as always, is by Amoria Armstrong, and our outro is by The Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week when Matt and I will surely have devoured even more pirate literature.
Church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still